Do you remember a time when you were playing rough with a friend and a grown-up stopped you? Or maybe you remember being a little rowdy and a teacher gave you a stern look. Has your mom or your dad ever asked you, in a voice that seemed a little harsh, to stop being so wild? It's no fun when that happens, but let's be honest. The grown-ups who ask you to calm down probably had a good reason to do so. Sometimes being rowdy or rough or wild can make a big mess, or hurt people who ought not to be hurt, or make it hard for other folks to do what they're meant to be doing. You know that, and I know that, but it's only one side of the story. Let me tell you about the other. Have you ever seen anyone be bullied? Have you ever seen a bigger boy push down a smaller one and then laugh about it? Think about how you felt when you saw that, especially if the smaller boy was a friend of yours. Maybe you suddenly wanted to be rough and rowdy and wild toward that big cruel bully. You probably felt your face get warm and your shoulders get tight. Maybe you even made a fist with your hand. But then you felt something different. Maybe you thought that if you walked right up to that bully and gave him a good push, a grown-up would come running, and you'd be in trouble really quick. Maybe you remember someone telling you that fighting wasn't allowed, and as you thought of this, maybe you let your fist relax a bit. Besides, it's scary to try and push down a bully. It feels nice to think that you might not have to stand up to him, especially since you might get in trouble if you did. Maybe you've stopped listening to that little voice inside you that says, help that little kid out and stomp that bully if you can. Does it seem like there's a problem here? Maybe you know what the problem is. If everyone went around roughhousing and play fighting all the time, even games like tag or hide and seek would be impossible, not to mention eating dinner. On the other hand, if you were always afraid that playing rough, being rowdy, or acting a bit wild would get you into trouble, you probably wouldn't do it very much. Then you probably wouldn't have the courage to help the little kid who's just been pushed down. That's because playing rough builds courage, and all boys and girls need courage. The bully, however bad, has plenty of courage to do wrong. Do you have the courage to do right? That thing inside you that makes you want to wrestle with your friends is the same sort of thing that makes you have the courage to tackle the bully. But what if you aren't allowed to wrestle with your friends? You probably won't tackle the bully. And this is the problem. It's a problem that matters to grown-ups, too. Back when most of Europe went to war, a very wise man named C.S. Lewis was worried about this problem. He knew that many of the young men in his country had been taught to have what they called good manners. They were taught to be polite, not to argue, not to cause a stir, and not to pick a fight. They could sit so well at a dinner table that you'd think they were statues. You should have seen them in church, not a wiggle or a squirm. But they weren't as good at being rough and rowdy as boys were back in the old days. Teachers and parents were giving children less and less of a chance to be rough and rowdy. That was fine when it was time to eat dinner or go to church, but not so good when it came time to fight a bully. Then war broke out. There were people in Germany who decided that they should be in charge of the whole world. They were bullies. Mr. Lewis was worried that the young men in his country had forgotten a very important lesson. That there's a time to be rough and a time to be gentle. That there's a time to be rowdy and a time to be controlled. And that there's a time to be wild and a time to be calm. Because Mr. Lewis studied old books, he knew how things were back in the days of knights and armor and castles. Back then, people were taught to be very polite and quiet and mannerly in some places, but they were expected to be very fierce and angry and even dangerous in other places. The same knight who would know how to be very kind and gentle when visiting with a beautiful damsel in her castle could become a wild warrior who broke the shields and cracked the metal helmets of bad guys when the bad guys tried to hurt those damsels. You've maybe heard of Sir Lancelot. He was the best knight of all time, and when he died, his friend, Sir Ector, said this over his dead body. "Thou wert the meekest man that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear at rest." That's how knights in the old days talked. What we would say is this: you were the kindest and gentlest man when that was required, and you were so good at table manners and all that stuff, but you were also the roughest, toughest, meanest man that there ever was when you had to fight a bully. Mr. Lewis had a name for this. He called it chivalry. He said that chivalry was the ability to be kind and quiet when that's what was needed, and to be rough and harsh when that's what was needed, and also the ability to know which was needed when. He could see that chivalry was necessary. We couldn't do without it. It's necessary because there will always be bullies around who don't want to be kind and quiet and calm, and who want to use their unkindness, loudness, and wildness to hurt others unfairly. Mr. Lewis could see that this was what was happening when those people from Germany were trying to take over the world. Without someone in the world who was just as rough and rowdy as those Germans, there was a good chance that those Germans would succeed and probably be very unkind to the people they conquered. But if the people who fought off the German bullies kept being rowdy and rough, even after they came back home to their wives and children, we'd be no better off for having beaten the Germans. We'd have people almost as bad as those Germans right in our midst. And it isn't always easy to know which you should be. This is why parents and other grown-ups can help you by reminding you to be calm or quiet, especially at church or school or the dinner table. But Mr. Lewis hoped that sometimes you would be allowed to be rough and rowdy and wild when you were playing with your friends in fun, or even, if you have to, when pushing down a bully. Mr. Lewis would want us all to be like Sir Lancelot, to be kind and gentle when we were supposed to be, but to be ready with our sword and spear in hand to be rough and rowdy toward the real bullies of the world.